And so this is going to be the 10th ministerial conference by the World Trade Organization, but the 9th conference did happen in Bali, Indonesia, where the Bali package was adopted. Among the issues that were adopted was streamlining trade. But now, to put into perspective for us more on the 10th ministerial conference by the WTO, we are joined by Jason Kapkirok, who is the Senior Director at Trademark East Africa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Joy.
So there's a lot of expectations in Kenya today and on the African continent, this being the first time in about 20 years that Africa and Kenya is hosting the 10th ministerial conference. What is the relevance of global trade for Africa in this case?
Well, Joy, thanks a lot, and nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Actually, this is the first time that the WTO Ministerial Conference is taking place in Africa. The last time it happened was in Morocco, but that was not WTO, that was GATS.
Right.
So this is a historic opportunity, and it has a lot of relevance. To go to your question. WTO is the only organization globally that is trying to come up with rules of trade to basically facilitate the flow of goods and services, trade flows basically. So it's the only organization that is trying to come up with rules of the game that allows a fair play for all parties involved in global trade. So it's extremely important. And you mentioned the Bali package, the WTO Bali Trade Facilitation Agreement that was signed in That was quite historic, and it's estimated that, for example, if that is implemented, it will result in reduction of trade costs by up to about 14% for least developing countries, and about 13% for middle-income economies. So it's huge benefits to everyone, basically. Subject to full implementation of that agreement.
All right. Now, looking at it from the African perspective, of course, a number of issues have come out during the Bali package, or rather the Bali ministerial conference. There were a number of issues that did come up, like, subsidies, agricultural subsidies, and so many other issues regarding export competition. But let's look at the continental free trade area. How lucrative is it for other African nations that fall in the category of developing countries?
First of all, one thing that needs to be understood is that this WTO Ministerial Conference is taking place against the backdrop of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, the climate conference that is coming to an end in Paris. So this is extremely important. Now for Africa, it's also happening at a time when Africa, last year in Cairo, signed an agreement, the Tripartite Free Trade Area Agreement that encompasses about 26 African countries that are trying to create an environment to promote intra-Africa trade among the 26 African countries through preferential treatment in terms of tariffs and so on. So it's important to see this event within that wider context, globally, but also regionally. In Africa, efforts being made to actually create, and it's important to understand that it's always been like a two-speed process. Globally, we agree a compact, but in terms of implementation, because of certain delays, countries come together regionally and then come up with a package and agree and implement it fast. And it's always going to proceed that way. In East Africa here, we have the East African Community. The East African Community obviously is trying to create an economic space that allows free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor, and also an environment where trade can thrive among the members. But this is all happening within the overall framework of WTO rules.
All right.
Because WTO rules allow for these variable speeds. In other words, it allows for these regional economic groupings also to come together and then basically form a compact and promote their interests.
All right,
Yeah.
so a number of African countries are seeking for, better terms, or at least a better trading field within the African continent and outside of the African continent. But look at the blocks that we have, COMESA, SADC, and the EAC as well. While we are trying to seek trade facilitation with the outside world, that is outside of the African continent, our trade blocks are not really harmonized, and that is a big challenge. So why are we even seeking to harmonize trade outside of the continent when we cannot trade in a balanced way amongst ourselves?
Well, the answer is that trade negotiations are historically very difficult. You mentioned the case of, for example, export subsidies in agriculture, which is a very big issue because most African countries rely heavily on agriculture.
Right.
And also it's very important for them to protect those markets against dumping and also subsidies that subsidize their imports, I mean, exports from outside, export subsidies. So it is traditionally very difficult to come to some agreement. And this is primarily the reason why you have groups of countries coming together that are more willing, more ready, and more prepared to implement certain agreements. And so you'll see what is agreed globally are big issues, but when it comes to actual implementation, you have smaller groups of countries coming together, and that's how COMESA, SADC, EAC needs to be understood.
Right.
Yeah, and also the Tripartite Free Trade Area Agreement that encompasses 26 countries in Africa, trying to agree and then move the agenda much further.
Much further.
Obviously, WTO is a global arena, and it's not easy to agree on some of these issues.
And that
Very
is why it has
contentious.
been, dragging a lot, even with the Doha round, or
which
the
has
Doha
taken
agenda.
about 15 years, and therefore the Bali Trade Facilitation Agreement was a real breakthrough when it did happen.
Right.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. We do appreciate the time taken to come talk to us about the World Trade Organization 10th Ministerial Conference, at least setting the stage for what some of those expectations might be. Jason Kapkirok is the Senior Director at Trademark East Africa, setting the stage for us for the 10th Ministerial Conference happening here in Nairobi, Kenya. The first time in Kenya, the first time in Africa. That's it for business. My name is Joy Doreen Bira. But for more news, log on to our website, standardmedia.co.ke or ktnnews.com.